The acrid stench of smoke filled Grace Porter's lungs as she stumbled toward the silhouette of a man on horseback, her soot-stained dress torn and her face streaked with tears. She had been running for what felt like hours, the memory of flames consuming everything she loved still burning behind her eyelids. The Montana Territory of 1878 had seemed like a place for new beginnings when she'd arrived just 6 months ago. Now it had become a nightmare. "They burned my home," she cried, her voice breaking as her legs finally gave out beneath her. The dust of the trail clouded around her knees as she collapsed, the weight of her loss crushing her spirit. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs jingling softly as his boots hit the ground. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his hat, but she could see the firm set of his jaw, the concern in his eyes as he knelt before her. "Then my ranch is yours till you're strong again," he said simply, his voice deep and steady like the distant roll of thunder across the plains. Grace looked up at him, this stranger offering sanctuary when she had nothing left but the clothes on her back and the wedding ring of her dead husband. She didn't know then that this moment would change everything, that the hand extended toward her belonged to a man who would heal her broken heart in ways she couldn't yet imagine. His name was Hayes Jackson, and his compassion in her darkest hour would be the first of many reasons she would eventually come to love him. Grace took his outstretched hand, calloused from years of hard work, and allowed herself to be helped to her feet. "I'm Grace," she managed, her throat raw from screaming as she'd watched her homestead burn. "Grace Porter." "Hayes Jackson," he replied, his eyes green as the spring grass assessing her condition. "My ranch is about 3 miles west of here. You need water, food, and rest. Questions can wait." He led her to his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion that stood calmly despite the scent of smoke that still clung to Grace's clothing. With gentle hands, Hayes lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. His arms created a protective circle around her as he reached for the reins, and despite herself, Grace felt the first hint of safety since the attack. "Who did this to you, Mrs. Porter?" he asked softly as they began to ride. "Men," she answered, her voice hollow. "5 of them. They wanted our land, said they represented some mining company my husband Henry refused to sell." She swallowed hard. "They shot him first, then set fire to everything." Hayes's body tensed behind her. "The Blackwater Mining Company," Grace nodded weakly. "Yes, that was the name." "How did you know?" "They've been terrorizing smaller homesteaders for months now. The law hasn't done much to stop them." His voice hardened. "Sheriff Wilkins seems more interested in their money than justice." The rhythmic sway of the horse beneath them, and the steady beat of Hayes's heart against her back lulled Grace into an exhausted daze. The landscape blurred around them, rolling hills giving way to scattered pine trees, and eventually a valley that cradled what must be the Jackson Ranch. It was larger than Grace had expected. A substantial 2-story house stood proudly, with a large barn and several outbuildings nearby. Fenced pastures stretched into the distance where cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of the tragedy that had brought a stranger to their home. "Welcome to the Rocking J," Hayes said as they approached. "It's been in my family for 15 years. My father built it, passed it to me 5 years ago before he and my mother moved back east." A ranch hand emerged from the barn, his eyes widening at the sight of a woman in Hayes's arms. "Elijah," Hayes called out, "go fetch Mrs. Thornton from the cookhouse. Tell her we have an injured guest who needs attending to." The young man nodded and ran toward one of the buildings. Disappearing inside with careful movements, Hayes dismounted and then reached up to help Grace down. Her legs buckled immediately and he caught her, lifting her effortlessly into his arms. "I'm sorry," she whispered, embarrassed by her weakness. "Nothing to apologize for," he replied, carrying her toward the house. "Anyone who survived what you did today has more strength than most men I know." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable. Simple furnishings but clean and well kept, with touches that spoke of a woman's influence. At some point, hand-stitched curtains, a patchwork quilt over the back of a chair. Hayes placed her gently on a sofa in what appeared to be a sitting room. Mrs. Thornton will be here shortly. She's our cook and housekeeper. Been with the family since I was a boy. She'll help get you cleaned up and settled." True to his word, an older woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a severe bun bustled into the room minutes later, her kind eyes assessing Grace with motherly concern. "Lord above," she murmured. "What happened to this poor child?" "Blackwater Mining Company," Hayes said grimly. "They burned her homestead, killed her husband." Mrs. Thornton's mouth set in a hard line. "Those devils." She moved quickly to Grace's side. "Come, dear, let's get you cleaned up and into fresh clothes. I've already set water to heating." Grace allowed herself to be led upstairs to a bedroom that smelled of lavender and clean linen. Mrs. Thornton helped her undress, gasping softly at the bruises and small burns that dotted Grace's pale skin. "They didn't." The older woman began, her implication clear. "No," Grace answered quickly. "They were more interested in the land than in me. I ran as soon as I saw what they'd done to Henry." Relief washed over Mrs. Thornton's face. "Small mercies," she said. "Now into the bath with you. I'll find something for you to wear." Mr. Hayes's sister left some dresses behind when she married and moved to Denver last year. She was about your size. The warm water was both heaven and hell, soothing her aching body while washing away the physical remnants of her former life. Grace scrubbed until her skin was pink, trying to remove the phantom scent of smoke that seemed embedded in her very pores. When she finally emerged, dressed in a simple blue calico that had belonged to Hayes's sister, Mrs. Thornton had prepared a light meal and tea. "Mr. Hayes would like to speak with you when you're ready," the housekeeper said as Grace picked at the food, her appetite non-existent despite not having eaten since breakfast. "He's in his study downstairs, but there's no rush, dear. You can rest first if you prefer." Grace shook her head. "No, I'd rather speak with him now. He's offered me sanctuary. The least I can do is explain my situation fully." Mrs. Thornton nodded approvingly. "He's a good man, Mr. Hayes. Lost his wife 3 years ago to fever. Hasn't been the same since, but he's fair and honest. You could have found worse places to land in your time of need." This new information about her benefactor settled in Grace's mind as she made her way downstairs. A widower, like her now. Perhaps that explained the immediate understanding in his eyes. When he'd found her on the road, he knew what it was to lose everything that mattered. Hayes was standing by the window when she entered his study, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and something flickered across his face, surprise, perhaps, at her transformation from the soot-covered woman he'd rescued. "Mrs. Porter," he said, placing his drink on the desk, "you look better. Thanks to your kindness and Mrs. Thornton's care," she replied, suddenly aware of how her borrowed dress fit differently than her own modest clothing had. It was slightly more fashionable, more flattering to her figure. She folded her hands in front of her, unsure what to do with them. "I don't know how to thank you properly for what you've done." "No thanks needed," Hayes gestured to a chair. "Please sit, you must still be exhausted." Grace sat, her back straight despite her fatigue. "I want to explain what happened. You deserve that much." Hayes nodded, settling into the chair behind his desk. "I'm listening." For the next hour, Grace related everything: how she and Henry had married in Illinois 2 years ago, how they'd saved every penny to buy land in Montana, their dreams of building a prosperous farm. Then came the men from the Blackwater Mining Company 6 weeks ago, offering to buy their land for a fraction of its worth. Henry had discovered that gold had been found in the creek that ran through their property. He'd refused to sell. "They came back today," she finished, her voice hollow. 5 men on horseback. Their leader, a man called Silas Reed, shot Henry when he went out to confront them. I was inside. I saw it through the window. Her fingers twisted the wedding band she still wore. They dragged his body away, then set fire to the house and barn. I escaped out the back and hid in the woods until they left. Then I just started walking. Hayes's expression had darkened throughout her story. "Reed is Blackwater's enforcer. He's done this before. The sheriff claims there's never enough evidence to arrest him." "There were witnesses this time," Grace said bitterly. "Me. Which makes you dangerous to them," Hayes pointed out, "if they discover you survived." The implication hung heavily in the air between them. You can stay here as long as needed, Hayes said after a moment. My offer stands. The ranch is yours to call home until you decide what comes next. I can't accept charity indefinitely, Grace protested. I've always worked for my keep. A hint of a smile touched Hayes's lips. I wouldn't worry about that, Mrs. Thornton has been complaining for months that she needs help with the house. The ranch hands are useless at anything involving a needle or broom, and the place has suffered since my sister married and left. Then I'll earn my keep, Grace said firmly, starting tomorrow. Hayes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Porter. Most would still be collapsed with grief. The grief is there, she admitted quietly. But survival comes first. Henry would want that, he nodded. Get some rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to start your new duties. He rose, signaling the end of their conversation. And Mrs. Porter, yes, you're safe here, I give you my word. Something in the way he said it, the absolute certainty in his voice, made Grace believe him, despite the horror she had witnessed. For the first time since watching her husband fall, she felt the iron band of fear around her chest loosen slightly. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night, though her dreams were plagued by flames and gunshots. She woke before dawn, disoriented in the unfamiliar bedroom, momentarily forgetting the tragedy that had brought her there. Reality crashed back quickly, bringing with it a fresh wave of grief that threatened to drown her. Grace forced herself to rise, to wash her face in the basin of cool water on the dresser, to braid her long auburn hair with fingers that trembled only slightly. The routine tasks anchored her to the present, keeping the worst of her sorrow at bay. Mrs. Thornton found her in the kitchen an hour later, already at work preparing breakfast for the household. "Child, you didn't need to start so early," the housekeeper chided, though approval gleamed in her eyes. "Idle hands invite dark thoughts," Grace replied simply. "Besides, I meant what I said about earning my keep." The older woman nodded in understanding. "Well, between the two of us, we'll have this place running smoother than it has in years. Mr. Hayes doesn't care much about comfort since Mrs. Olivia passed, but a man still needs a proper home." As they worked side by side, Mrs. Thornton told Grace about the ranch and its operations. Hayes ran 500 head of cattle with the help of 8 regular hands, plus extra workers during roundup and branding seasons. The Rocking J was one of the more successful operations in the territory, largely due to Hayes's forward thinking. He'd been one of the first to crossbreed his Longhorns with Herefords for better meat quality. "He's respected in these parts," Mrs. Thornton said as she kneaded dough for biscuits. "Not just for the ranch, but because he stands up for what's right. That's made him enemies too, mind you, especially with the mining interests moving in." "Like Blackwater," Grace murmured, "exactly like Blackwater." Their boss, Emmett Sinclair, offered to buy the northeast section of the Rocking J last year, said there were mineral deposits worth exploring. Mr. Hayes refused, said he wouldn't sell his family's land for any price, especially not to men who take what they want through intimidation. The ranch hands began filing in for breakfast soon after, each tipping their hats respectfully to Grace as Mrs. Thornton introduced her. They were a diverse group, young and old, some clearly born to the saddle and others who seemed to have found their way to ranch work through less direct paths. All showed obvious respect for their employer, who entered last. Hayes paused momentarily when he saw Grace serving coffee, but recovered quickly. "Good morning, Mrs. Porter. I trust you slept well as could be expected," she answered honestly. "Thank you again for your hospitality." He nodded, accepting a cup of coffee from her hands, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. "I'm riding into town this morning to speak with Sheriff Wilkins about what happened at your homestead." Grace set down the coffee pot with more force than necessary. "Will that do any good?" "Probably not," Hayes admitted. "But an official report needs to be filed. Your husband deserves that much." The ranch hands exchanged glances, clearly aware of the situation but polite enough not to ask questions directly. One of them, an older man with a weather-beaten face that spoke of decades under the western sun, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hayes, if you're heading to town, mind if I ride along? Got some personal business to tend to." Hayes nodded. "Of course, Frank." He turned back to Grace. "Would you care to join us, Mrs. Porter? I understand if it's too soon to revisit the area, but your testimony would strengthen the case." Grace straightened her spine. "Yes, I'll come. Henry deserves justice, and I won't hide from those men." Approval flashed in Hayes's eyes. "We'll leave in an hour, then." The ride to town was tense but uneventful. Grace sat beside Hayes on the wagon bench, with Frank following on horseback. The landscape looked different in daylight, beautiful in its rugged way, with distant mountains framing rolling grasslands. Under any other circumstances, Grace might have appreciated the scenery. Today, she could only scan the horizon nervously for signs of riders. Mill Creek was a typical frontier town, one main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, side streets branching off with a mixture of businesses and modest homes. It wasn't large, perhaps 500 residents, but it served as the commercial center for the surrounding ranches and farms. Hayes helped Grace down from the wagon in front of the sheriff's office, his hand lingering supportively at her elbow for a moment. "Frank, would you mind escorting Mrs. Porter to Jameson's general store after we're done here? She'll need some personal items." Frank nodded. "Be happy to, boss." The sheriff's office was small but orderly. Sheriff Wilkins himself was a surprise to Grace, younger than she'd expected, perhaps only in his mid-30s, with a neatly trimmed mustache and intelligent eyes. He stood when they entered, regarding Hayes with what appeared to be wary respect. "Jackson," he greeted before turning his attention to Grace. "Madam." Hayes made the introductions, then explained the purpose of their visit. As Grace recounted the events of the previous day, she watched the sheriff's face carefully. His expression remained professionally neutral, but she detected something like resignation in his eyes. When she finished, Wilkins sighed heavily. "Mrs. Porter, I'm truly sorry for your loss. What happened to your husband and property is inexcusable. Then you'll arrest Silas Reed and his men." Grace pressed. The sheriff glanced at Hayes before answering. "I'll investigate the incident thoroughly, but without physical evidence or corroborating witnesses." "She is a witness," Hayes interrupted, his voice hard, "a credible one." "One witness against 5 men who will all swear they were elsewhere," Wilkins countered. "You know how these cases go, Jackson." "I know how they go when the sheriff is in the pocket of mining interests," Hayes said coldly. The sheriff's face flushed. "That's uncalled for." "I uphold the law to the best of my ability." "The selective application of law is no justice at all," Hayes responded. Grace laid a restraining hand on Hayes's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Sheriff Wilkins, all I ask is that you investigate. My husband was murdered in cold blood. Our property was destroyed. Surely that deserves your attention." Wilkins had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'll ride out to your homestead today, Mrs. Porter, see what evidence remains. That's all I can promise for now." It wasn't much, but it was something. Grace nodded her acceptance. As they left the sheriff's office, Hayes was visibly frustrated. "He won't do anything. Sinclair has too many officials in his pocket." "Then we'll find another way to get justice," Grace said quietly. Hayes looked at her with new respect. "We will," he agreed. "But first, let's get you what you need from Jameson's. Frank will accompany you while I stop by the newspaper office. Nathaniel Green is the editor of the Mill Creek Gazette. He's been documenting Blackwater's tactics for months. Your story should interest him." The general store was overwhelming in its normality. Grace moved through the aisles in a daze, selecting the basic necessities: a hairbrush, a nightgown, undergarments, a few toiletries. Frank stood respectfully near the entrance, giving her privacy while remaining protectively nearby. Mrs. Jameson, the proprietor's wife, helped Grace select a ready-made dress that wouldn't require alterations. "Such a terrible thing. What happened to you?" she said softly as she wrapped Grace's purchases. "The whole town's talking about it." Not the first time Blackwater's done something like this, but perhaps the most brazen. "The whole town knows already?" Grace asked, surprised. Mrs. Jameson nodded. "Word travels fast, especially when it involves the Blackwater Mining Company." She leaned closer. "They're not well liked, except by those they pay off. Most decent folks know they're nothing but thugs with money. This was both comforting and concerning. If the town already knew her story, that meant Blackwater knew she had survived. Hayes had been right to worry about her safety. As they left the store, Grace noticed a group of men watching them from outside the saloon across the street. One man in particular, tall, with a distinctive red vest and black hat, stared at her with unsettling intensity. Frank moved closer to her side. "Keep walking, Mrs. Porter," he said quietly. "That's Silas Reed and his boys." Grace's blood ran cold, but she kept her head high as they made their way back to the sheriff's office where Hayes had arranged to meet them. The memory of Reed's face as he had shot Henry down was seared into her mind. Seeing him now, casually drinking in the middle of town while her husband lay dead, ignited a fury she hadn't known she possessed. Hayes emerged from the newspaper office just as they approached. One look at Grace's face and then across the street told him everything he needed to know. "Get in the wagon," he said tersely. "Frank, ride alongside." As Hayes helped Grace up, Reed called out from across the street, "That's a mighty pretty new housekeeper you got there, Jackson. Shame about her losing her place so sudden-like." Hayes's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond, instead climbing up beside Grace and taking the reins. "You just remember what happens to folks who don't cooperate with Blackwater," Reed shouted as they pulled away. "First warning's always the gentlest." The threat hung in the air behind them as Hayes urged the horses to a brisk pace. Only when they were well outside of town did he speak. "I'm sorry you had to face him," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Nathaniel is going to run your story in tomorrow's paper. It won't bring justice immediately, but it will put pressure on Wilkins to act." Grace nodded, still shaken by the encounter. Reed wasn't even trying to hide. He's not afraid of consequences. Men like that rarely are until someone finally stands up to them. Hayes glanced at her. "The ranch hands will take turns keeping watch at night. I don't think Reed would be foolish enough to attack the Rocking Jay directly, but I won't take chances with your safety." The protective note in his voice warmed something in Grace that had been cold since Henry's death. It wasn't just physical safety Hayes offered, but the security of knowing someone cared what happened to her. "Thank you," she said simply. "For everything," he nodded, his eyes returning to the road ahead. "You're one of mine now, Mrs. Porter. The Rocking Jay protects its own, one of his." The words settled into Grace's heart, providing an unexpected comfort. In the span of 24 hours, she had lost everything, yet somehow found a place where she might belong. It wasn't home not yet, but perhaps it could be in time. The days that followed established a new routine for Grace. She rose early each morning to help Mrs. Thornton with breakfast for the hands, then turned her attention to the house itself. Years of bachelor living had left the place functional but lacking in comfort. Grace took satisfaction in bringing order to neglected rooms, mending curtains, polishing furniture that hadn't seen proper care since Hayes's wife had passed. Hayes himself was often gone from sunrise to sunset, managing the vast operation of the ranch. When their paths did cross, he was unfailingly polite, but somewhat distant, a man accustomed to holding himself apart from others. Grace occasionally caught him watching her with an unreadable expression, but he would quickly look away when noticed. The newspaper article about Henry's murder and the destruction of their homestead appeared as promised. It was strongly worded, describing Blackwater's reign of terror, and questioning why the sheriff hadn't made arrests despite credible eyewitness testimony. It named Silas Reed directly and implied that Emmett Sinclair, Blackwater's owner, was ultimately responsible. Sheriff Wilkins rode out to the ranch the day after the article appeared, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Porter," he said, removing his hat as Grace met him on the porch. "I visited what remains of your homestead. There wasn't much left to examine." "I didn't expect there would be," she replied coolly. "They were thorough in their destruction." The sheriff shifted his weight. "I've questioned Silas Reed and his men. They all claim they were in but that day, meeting with Mr. Sinclair. Several witnesses at the Blackwater office confirmed their presence." "They're lying," Grace said flatly. "I saw Reed shoot my husband with my own eyes." "I believe you," Wilkins said, surprising her. But belief isn't enough in a court of law without evidence or another witness. You're letting them get away with murder, she accused. The sheriff had the decency to look ashamed. I'm doing what I can within the law, Mrs. Porter. Blackwater has powerful connections, not just here but in the territorial capital. They've bought judges, legislators. So ordinary people just have to accept being terrorized, Grace demanded. No, came Hayes's voice as he strode up from the direction of the barn. They don't. The sheriff turned, his expression hardening. Jackson, I know what you're thinking, and I'm telling you now, don't. Vigilante justice will only make things worse. Is it vigilante justice to defend what's rightfully yours? Hayes asked quietly, because that's all I intend to do. Protect my land and the people on it. Wilkins shook his head. Reed's been asking questions about Mrs. Porter in town. He knows she's staying here. Be careful, both of you. He settled his hat back on his head. That's not an official warning, you understand, just one neighbor talking to another. After the sheriff rode away, Hayes turned to Grace. We need to talk. In his study, Hayes poured 2 glasses of whiskey, offering one to Grace. She hesitated, then accepted it, the burn of the liquor steadying her nerves as Hayes explained what he knew. Blackwater isn't just after small homesteaders anymore. They're making moves on established ranches. 3 operations north of here have sold in the last month, all under market value. Sinclair's found gold in the foothills, and now he wants all the land he can get. And you think the Rocking J is on his list? Grace concluded. Hayes nodded. I've already refused him once. Your presence here, a witness to their methods, makes me an even bigger target. I should leave, Grace said immediately. I won't bring danger to your door after all you've done for me. No, Hayes's response was swift and firm. Running won't solve anything. Sinclair will find you wherever you go, and the Rocking J is safer than anywhere else you might hide. He took a drink from his glass. Besides, the hands are loyal. They'll fight for the ranch if it comes to that. I hope it doesn't, Grace said quietly. Hayes's expression softened slightly. So do I, but hope isn't a strategy. He hesitated, then added, How much did Henry teach you about firearms? The question caught her off guard. Enough to hunt rabbits with a rifle. Why? Because every person on this ranch needs to be able to defend themselves. Hayes set down his glass. Tomorrow we start your shooting lessons. True to his word, Hayes took Grace to a remote corner of the ranch the next morning. He brought 2 revolvers and a Winchester rifle, setting up targets on fence posts at varying distances. The revolver is more practical for a woman, he explained, demonstrating how to load and hold the weapon. Easier to conceal, quicker to draw in close quarters. Grace listened attentively, trying to focus on his instructions rather than the proximity of his body as he positioned her arms, adjusted her stance. His hands were warm and sure against her skin, his voice low in her ear as he explained how to aim and breathe. Squeeze the trigger gently, don't pull, he advised, and always assume a gun is loaded even when you're certain it isn't. Her first shots went wild, the recoil stronger than she'd anticipated. But by midday, she was hitting the target consistently, if not always precisely where she aimed. You're a natural, Hayes commented, genuine approval in his voice. Most new shooters don't progress this quickly. Grace lowered the revolver, surprised by the pleasure his praise brought her. I had a good teacher. Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth she hadn't seen before, but it was quickly masked. We'll practice every day until you're comfortable, the rifle too, though that's better for distance. As they packed up to return to the ranch house, Grace asked the question that had been nagging at her. Do you really think Blackwater will attack the ranch? Hayes considered before answering. Not directly, not at first. They'll try intimidation tactics, threatening the hands when they're in town, maybe rustling some cattle if that doesn't work. He shrugged. Men like Sinclair and Reed don't accept defeat gracefully. And the law won't help us, Grace concluded. The law helps those who pay for it, Hayes said grimly. But there's something more powerful than law out here. What's that, community? Hayes gestured toward the distant mountains. Every independent rancher and farmer in this valley faces the same threat from Blackwater. Alone, we're vulnerable. Together, we might stand a chance. Understanding dawned on Grace. You're organizing resistance, Hayes nodded. Meeting tonight at the Edwards place 3 miles east. 15 ranchers and homesteaders have confirmed they're coming. He hesitated. I'd like you to attend. Tell them what happened to Henry and your land. Make it real for them. The thought of recounting that terrible day to a room full of strangers was daunting, but Grace understood the necessity. I'll do it, she agreed, if it helps prevent another murder. The Edwards Ranch was smaller than the Rocking J but well-maintained, with a large barn that had been cleared for the meeting. Men and a few women from surrounding properties filled the space, their faces grave as they greeted Hayes with nods of recognition. Grace felt their curious gazes as Hayes led her to the front of the room, but she held her head high. These were her neighbors now, potential allies in the fight against Blackwater. She needed their support as much as they needed her testimony. Thomas Edwards, a burly man with a salt and pepper beard, called the meeting to order. We all know why we're here. Blackwater Mining is swallowing up land across the valley using methods that don't bear scrutiny. Hayes Jackson has brought someone with first-hand experience of their tactics. Hayes introduced Grace briefly, then stepped aside for her to speak. Taking a deep breath, she recounted the events of that terrible day with as much clarity and detail as she could manage. She described Reed's cold-blooded murder of Henry, the deliberate burning of their home, the threats made to others who refused to sell. When she finished, the barn was silent save for the occasional stamping of horses outside. Then a woman in the back, gray-haired and straight-backed, spoke up. They threatened to poison our well if we didn't sell, said it would be tragic when our grandchildren got sick. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. My husband said we should take what they offered. What choice do we have against men like that? We have the choice to stand together, Hayes answered. Blackwater can intimidate one family at a time, but they can't fight all of us at once. What exactly are you proposing, Jackson? Asked a rancher near the front. A mutual defense pact, Hayes said simply. If Blackwater threatens one, they threaten all. We establish patrols across our properties, share information, protect each other's interests. Discussion erupted, some voicing support, others expressing skepticism. Grace watched Hayes navigate the debate with steady logic and occasional flashes of passion that revealed how deeply he cared about the land and its people. My family didn't build the Rocking J just to see it stripped for gold, he told them. And I doubt any of you worked your land for years just to surrender it to thugs. We have a choice: stand now or lose everything. By the meeting's end, 12 of the 15 property owners had agreed to Hayes's pact. They established a schedule for patrols, arranged signals for emergencies, and agreed to meet weekly to share information about Blackwater's activities. On the ride back to the ranch, Grace found herself studying Hayes's profile in the moonlight. You were impressive in there, she said softly. They respect you. Hayes kept his eyes on the trail. They're good people, salt of the earth. They deserve better than being driven off land they've worked honestly. As do you, Grace ventured. He glanced at her then, his expression softening. The Rocking J is more than land to me. It's my father's legacy, my future. I intend to pass it to my children someday. The mention of children brought a pang to Grace's heart. She and Henry had dreamed of starting a family once their farm was established. Now those dreams were ashes, like everything else they'd built. Hayes seemed to realize his misstep. I'm sorry. That was thoughtless of me. No, Grace shook her head. It's natural to think of the future. I just haven't been able to see mine clearly since Henry died. It will come, Hayes said gently. Not the future you planned, but a future nonetheless. You're too full of life to remain in mourning forever. His words touched something deep within her, a recognition that while part of her had died with Henry, much of her remained alive, with needs and desires and possibilities stretching before her. It was both frightening and liberating to acknowledge. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. At the ranch, Hayes helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. Thank you for speaking tonight, he said, his voice low in the darkness. Your courage gives others strength. Grace looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood, of the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her dress. I should be thanking you for everything." For a breathless moment, something electric hung in the air between them, possibility, perhaps, or recognition of a connection deeper than circumstances. Then Hayes stepped back, breaking the spell. "Good night, Mrs. Porter," he said formally. "Good night, Mr. Jackson," she replied, ignoring the inexplicable disappointment that washed over her. As she prepared for bed that night, Grace caught her reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who had fled her burning homestead 3 weeks ago. That woman had been broken, defined by loss. This woman, still grieving, yes, but with a new purpose forming, seemed different, stronger. Her eyes held determination rather than despair. For the first time since Henry's death, Grace allowed herself to contemplate a future. Not to replace what she had lost, but to build something new from the ashes of her old life. The thought brought both guilt and hope in equal measure. The following morning brought news that changed everything. Frank burst into the kitchen where Grace and Mrs. Thornton were preparing breakfast, his expression grim. "Riders coming," he announced. 15, maybe 20, armed. Hayes appeared behind him, buckling his gun belt. "Blackwater," Frank nodded. "Looks like Reed's leading them. They're taking their time, still about 2 miles out." "Get the men," Hayes ordered. "Rifles on the north porch and from the barn loft. Nobody fires unless I give the word." As Frank rushed to comply, Hayes turned to Grace. "Stay inside with Mrs. Thornton. If shooting starts, go to the root cellar. There's a trapdoor in the floor that leads to a tunnel. It comes out in the stand of cottonwoods by the creek." "I'm not hiding in a cellar while you risk your life," Grace protested. "I can shoot now, remember? You taught me yourself." Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but Mrs. Thornton interrupted. "The girl's right. She's earned the right to defend this place same as any of us." The older woman moved to a cabinet, pulling out a shotgun. "I'll be watching the back door. No one's getting in that way." A reluctant smile touched Hayes's lips. "I see I'm outnumbered." He turned to Grace. "Get your revolver. Stay near me on the front porch. With luck, this is just intimidation." 10 minutes later, the Blackwater riders approached the main house at a walk, spreading out in a semicircle. Silas Reed led them, his red vest visible even at a distance. Behind him rode a man Grace didn't recognize, expensively dressed, with a neatly trimmed beard and the air of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Hayes stood on the porch, flanked by Grace and 4 ranch hands. The rest were positioned strategically around the property, rifles at the ready but out of sight. "That's far enough," Hayes called when the riders were 30 yards out. Reed signaled for the group to halt, his face splitting into a cold smile. "Now, Jackson, is that any way to greet visitors?" "We're just being neighborly." "State your business and move on," Hayes replied, his hand resting casually near his holster. The well-dressed man urged his horse forward a few steps. "Mr. Jackson, I'm Emmett Sinclair. I believe we've met before." "We have." "My answer hasn't changed." Sinclair's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Circumstances have, though. Your harboring of a fugitive, for instance." "Mrs. Porter is my guest," Hayes said evenly. "There are no fugitives here." "She's a witness against my company," Sinclair countered, "spreading lies about my men." "That's slander, Mr. Jackson, actionable in court." "Truth is an absolute defense against slander," Hayes replied, "and Mrs. Porter speaks only truth about what your men did to her husband and property." Sinclair's gaze shifted to Grace, assessing her with cold calculation. "I sympathize with your loss, Mrs. Porter. Tragic accidents happen in this territory, but false accusations can be dangerous." "It was no accident," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Your man Reed shot my husband in cold blood, then burned everything we owned." "I saw it with my own eyes." "A distraught widow's imagination," Sinclair dismissed. "No court would take your word over that of 5 respected businessmen." "Maybe not," Hayes interjected, "but her neighbors believe her." 15 ranches and homesteads have formed an alliance against Blackwater's tactics. Attack one, you attack all. Something flickered across Sinclair's face, surprise, perhaps, or frustration. "Business disputes should be handled through proper channels, Mr. Jackson, not vigilante alliances." "We tried proper channels," Hayes responded. Sheriff Wilkins seems remarkably uninterested in investigating murder when Blackwater is involved. Reed moved his horse forward, his hand resting on his holstered gun. You're making a mistake, Jackson. The lady's not worth dying for, and neither is this piece of land. That's where you're wrong, Hayes said quietly. Some things are worth any price. The tension stretched between the two groups, the air heavy with the promise of violence. Grace's fingers tightened on her revolver, heart pounding as she waited for someone to make the first move. Then, unexpectedly, riders appeared on the ridge behind the house, 8 men, rifles ready. Grace recognized Thomas Edwards at the lead. Looks like some of our Alliance members got word of your visit, Sinclair, Hayes observed, satisfaction evident in his voice. Might want to reconsider your options. Sinclair's face darkened as he assessed the new arrivals. With the addition of Edwards and his men, the Blackwater group no longer held the advantage in numbers. This isn't over, Jackson, he said finally. There are more ways than one to get what I want. You'll never get the Rocking J, Hayes stated flatly. Not while I'm alive. That condition can be changed, Reed muttered, just loud enough to be heard. Hayes's expression hardened. Is that a threat, Reed? Because I'd be happy to settle this right now, just you and me. Reed's hand twitched toward his gun, but Sinclair raised a restraining arm. Another time, perhaps. We'll be going now, but remember, Mr. Jackson, gold doesn't wait forever. The offer to buy your land stands for 1 more week after that. He shrugged eloquently. Business becomes more complicated. With that, he wheeled his horse around, Reed and the others following suit. They rode away at an unhurried pace, projecting confidence despite their retreat. Only when they disappeared over the ridge did Hayes relax slightly. Frank, send someone to thank Edwards and the others. Tell them we'll meet tonight to discuss what happened. The ranch hands dispersed, returning to their interrupted tasks while Hayes turned to Grace. You handled yourself well, he said, approval warming his tone. I was terrified, she admitted, but I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing it. That's courage, he replied. Being afraid but standing your ground anyway. As they walked back to the house, Grace voiced the question foremost in her mind. What happens now? Hayes's expression was grim. Now we prepare. Sinclair won't give up easily and Reed's the type to hold a grudge. They'll come back one way or another. I'm sorry I've brought this trouble to your door, Grace said softly. Hayes stopped, turning to face her fully. This trouble was coming with or without you, Grace. Blackwater wants my land. They would have found an excuse. His use of her given name, the first time he had done so, sent an unexpected warmth through her. If anything, your presence has strengthened our position. Your testimony united the valley against them in a way nothing else could have. They stood close, the morning sun illuminating Hayes's features, highlighting the determination in his eyes and something else, something that made Grace's breath catch in her throat. I should check on Mrs. Thornton, she said quickly, suddenly uncertain of the emotions swirling within her. She must be worried. Hayes nodded, stepping back. Of course, I need to speak with the men about increasing patrols. As she walked away, Grace pressed a hand to her racing heart. The intensity of Hayes's gaze had awakened feelings she wasn't prepared for. Attraction, certainly, but something deeper as well. A connection that felt both frightening and right. Henry had been dead barely a month. It was too soon to contemplate such feelings, too disloyal to the man she had loved. Yet she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Hayes Jackson, his strength, his integrity, his gentle consideration beneath the tough exterior. Grace threw herself into ranch work over the following days, hoping physical exhaustion would quiet her conflicted heart. She assisted Mrs. Thornton with household tasks, helped in the kitchen garden, and even learned to mend harnesses under Frank's patient tutelage. In the evenings, Hayes continued her shooting lessons, each session building her confidence with firearms. The alliance of ranchers established regular patrols across their combined properties, making it difficult for Blackwater men to approach any individual ranch undetected. Reports came in of Sinclair acquiring mining equipment and hiring more men, but no direct confrontations occurred. A week passed, then two. The deadline Sinclair had mentioned came and went without incident, putting everyone further on edge. The waiting was almost worse than direct conflict. "It's like watching storm clouds gather," Grace commented to Hayes one evening as they sat on the porch after supper, enjoying the cool air. "You know the lightning will strike, but not where or when." Hayes nodded, his profile strong in the fading light. "Sinclair's a businessman. He calculates his moves carefully. When he does strike, it won't be impulsive." "Unlike Reed," Grace observed. "Reed's a rabid dog," Hayes agreed. "Dangerous because he enjoys inflicting pain, but Sinclair keeps him leashed until it serves his purposes to let him loose." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as twilight deepened into dusk. Fireflies began to appear in the meadow beyond the house, their lights blinking on and off like earthbound stars. "It's beautiful here," Grace said softly. "I can see why you love it so much." Hayes turned toward her, his expression thoughtful. "It gets in your blood, the land, the seasons, the rhythm of ranch life." He hesitated, then added, "My wife never quite felt that way. She was a town girl, found the isolation difficult." It was the first time he had mentioned his late wife directly to Grace, and she understood the significance of his sharing. "That must have been hard for both of you," she said carefully. Hayes looked back toward the darkening landscape. "Olivia tried for my sake, but she was never happy here. She had tuberculosis. We knew when we married that her time was limited. I think she didn't want to deprive me of the family ranch, so she never asked to leave, even when the dry air made her condition worse." Regret colored his voice. "I should have put her needs first. Moved to Denver or back east where the doctors were better. Maybe she would have lived longer, or maybe not," Grace said gently. "Illness doesn't always follow predictable paths. You can't blame yourself for choices you both made." "Perhaps." He was silent for a moment. "How did you meet your husband?" The question caught Grace off guard, but she welcomed the chance to speak of Henry. "At a church social in Springfield. He was working as a carpenter then, saving to buy land. I was teaching at the local school." She smiled at the memory. "He was so shy. Took him 3 socials to work up the courage to ask me to dance. But once he did, we just knew." "You were happy together," Hayes observed. "Yes," Grace affirmed. "We wanted the same things, land of our own, children, a simple life built with our own hands." She sighed. "Dreams don't always come true the way we plan." "No," Hayes agreed. "But sometimes life gives us second chances at dreams, just in different forms than we expected." Their eyes met in the gathering darkness, and Grace felt that now familiar pull toward him stronger each day, harder to deny. Hayes leaned slightly toward her, his intention clear in his gaze. Before either could move further, Frank's voice called from the bunkhouse. "Mr. Hayes, rider coming in fast." The moment broken, Hayes stood quickly. "Stay here," he instructed before striding toward the approaching horseman. Grace ignored the directive, following a few paces behind. The rider was one of the hands from the Edwards ranch, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Blackwater's burning out the Millers," he gasped as he reined in. "Started about an hour ago. Mr. Edwards sent men to help but asked me to fetch you, said to bring as many armed men as you can spare." Hayes's face hardened. "Frank, gather the hands, everyone who can shoot. Leave 2 men to guard the house." He turned to Grace. "Stay here with Mrs. Thornton." "No," Grace said firmly. "The Millers have 3 children. Ellen will need help with them while the men fight. I'm coming." Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but time was critical. "Fine, get your revolver. We ride in 5 minutes." The night air was already tainted with smoke by the time they crested the ridge overlooking the Miller property. Flames engulfed the barn and were spreading to the house. Men on horseback circled the structures, occasionally firing into the windows where desperate defenders returned shots. "There," Hayes pointed to a cluster of figures sheltering behind a stone wall 100 yards from the house. "That must be Edwards and his men." They rode hard down the slope, staying in the shadows of trees until they reached the makeshift defensive position. Thomas Edwards greeted them with grim relief. "Glad you made it," he said. "Blackwater hit without warning, 20 men at least. Miller got his family out the back door when the shooting started. They're hiding in that grove of pines, but we can't reach them while Reed's men have the high ground." Hayes assessed the situation quickly. We need to split their attention. Frank, take 5 men around to the east side. Wait for my signal, then create a diversion. Edwards, you and your men push from the south when you hear the shooting start. I'll lead the rest straight up the middle, try to reach the Millers. As the men organized themselves according to Hayes's plan, Grace touched his arm. I'm going with you to the Millers. Ellen will need another woman's help with the children. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stay low, stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. The wait for Frank's diversion seemed endless. Grace crouched beside Hayes behind the stone wall, acutely aware of his presence, the tension in his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth where their shoulders touched. When gunfire erupted from the eastern edge of the property, Hayes squeezed her hand once. Now, stay close. They moved as a group through the darkness, using the smoke and confusion to their advantage. The Blackwater men turned toward the new threat, momentarily forgetting the defenders behind the wall. By the time they realized they were being flanked from multiple directions, Hayes and his group had covered half the distance to the pine grove. A shout went up, followed by a barrage of gunfire. Hayes pushed Grace down behind a water trough, returning fire with measured precision. Around them, the night erupted into chaos, muzzle flashes, screams, the thunder of hooves as mounted men tried to regroup. Make for the trees, Hayes ordered during a brief lull. I'll cover you. Grace hesitated, unwilling to leave him exposed. Together, she insisted. I won't go without you. Something flashed in his eyes, respect perhaps, or something deeper. On my mark then. 3, 2, 1. Now, they ran in a crouch across the open ground, bullets kicking up dirt around them. Grace's heart hammered in her chest, fear and exhilaration mixing in equal measure. They were halfway to the trees when a mounted figure appeared directly in their path, Silas Reed, his face twisted with malice in the firelight. Well, well, he drawled, leveling his pistol at Hayes. The hero and his widow, 2 birds, 1 bullet. Hayes pushed Grace behind him, his own weapon raised. It's over, Reed. Your men are outnumbered now. Reed laughed, a harsh sound. Doesn't matter if I kill you first. Time seemed to slow as Reed's finger tightened on the trigger. Grace acted on instinct, drawing her revolver and firing in one fluid motion just as Hayes had taught her. The shot caught Reed in the shoulder, throwing off his aim. His bullet went wide as he struggled to stay in the saddle. Hayes didn't waste the opportunity, firing twice in rapid succession. The first shot hit Reed in the chest, the second in the throat. He toppled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. Grace, Hayes's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you hurt? She shook her head, staring at Reed's body. I shot him, she whispered, the reality of her actions sinking in. You saved my life, Hayes corrected, gently taking the gun from her trembling hands. Come on, we need to reach the Millers. The fighting was winding down now, the remaining Blackwater men fleeing after seeing Reed fall. As Hayes and Grace reached the pine grove, Ellen Miller emerged with her 3 children clinging to her skirts, her face streaked with soot and tears. They're gone, she asked, voice quavering. Hayes nodded. They won't be back tonight. Rita's dead. Relief washed over Ellen's face, followed quickly by despair as she looked toward her burning home. Everything we built, gone. Grace stepped forward, taking the other woman's hands in hers. Not everything. You have your family, you have your land, you have neighbors who will help you rebuild. She glanced at Hayes. I know something about losing a home, but I also know about finding a new one. Ellen managed a watery smile. Thank you, both of you. In the aftermath, as men worked to contain the fire and tend to the wounded, Grace found herself standing apart, watching Hayes organize the efforts with quiet authority. The events of the night swirled in her mind, the violence, her own actions in shooting Reed, the strange clarity she felt in the midst of chaos. Hayes approached her eventually, his face smudged with smoke but his eyes clear and direct. You're all right. Yes, she answered honestly. I'm not sure I should be after what happened, but I am. He studied her for a moment. Taking a life changes you, even when it's necessary. I'd do it again, Grace said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. To save you, I'd do it without hesitation. Hayes's expression softened. Let's hope you never have to make that choice again. He glanced toward what remained of the Miller homestead. We need to get everyone back to safer ground. The Millers will stay at the Edwards place tonight. Tomorrow we'll start planning to rebuild. What about Blackwater? Grace asked. Reed is dead, but Sinclair is still out there. With Reed gone and the alliance holding firm, Sinclair might reconsider his tactics, Hayes replied. He's a businessman first, remember. If the cost becomes too high, he'll look elsewhere for easier profits. The ride back to the Rocking J was subdued. Exhaustion settled over everyone as the adrenaline of battle faded. Grace found herself riding close beside Hayes, drawing comfort from his solid presence. What you said to Ellen Miller, he said quietly as they approached the ranch. About finding a new home, did you mean that? Grace considered the question carefully. Yes, she admitted. I'll always grieve for Henry and what we lost, but these past weeks at the Rocking J, I've found something I wasn't looking for, a place to belong again. Hayes was silent for a long moment. When I found you on the road that day, I offered the ranch until you were strong again. I'm beginning to think I was the one who needed strength. What do you mean? Grace asked, heart quickening. After Olivia died, I closed myself off. Focused on the ranch, nothing else. Then you arrived grieving, yet still fighting for justice, for a future. His voice grew softer. You reminded me that a ranch is just land and buildings without people who matter to fill it. They had reached the house now, dismounting in the yard. The first pale light of dawn was breaking over the eastern hills, casting long shadows across the landscape. Hayes, Grace began, uncertain what she wanted to say but feeling the need to speak. He turned to her, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. I know it's too soon. You're still mourning Henry, and that's as it should be. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, I want you to know that the Rocking J could be more than a temporary haven for you. It could be home, permanently. The implication was clear, yet delicately phrased to respect her grief. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of something more complex: gratitude, hope, the first stirrings of a love she hadn't expected to find again. Thank you for understanding, she said softly, for not rushing what needs time to grow naturally. Hayes nodded, the gentleness in his eyes belying his rugged exterior. Some things are worth waiting for. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to the valley. News of Reed's death spread quickly, along with stories of the ranchers' alliance successfully defending the Miller property. Sinclair made no further moves against any of the allied ranches, and rumor had it that Blackwater Mining Company was shifting its operations further north, toward less organized territories. Sheriff Wilkins, perhaps emboldened by the changing tide, finally opened a formal investigation into Henry Porter's murder. With Reed dead and several Blackwater men willing to testify against their former employer to save themselves, there was talk of charges being brought against Sinclair himself. For Grace, the passage of time brought healing and clarity. She continued to wear Henry's ring, but the sharp edge of grief gradually softened into a gentler sorrow. She found purpose in her work at the ranch, satisfaction in helping the Millers rebuild their home, and unexpected joy in the quiet evenings spent with Hayes on the porch, talking about everything and nothing as their connection deepened. One evening in late summer, nearly 3 months after she had first stumbled onto the Rocking J, Grace found Hayes in his study examining papers spread across his desk. Mrs. Thornton said you wanted to see me, she said from the doorway. Hayes looked up, his face brightening at the sight of her. Yes, come in, I have something to show you. He indicated the papers before him, legal documents of some kind. These came from the Territorial Land Office today. They concern your homestead. Grace stiffened. What about it? With Reed dead and Sinclair under investigation, the territorial governor has nullified all recent Blackwater land acquisitions obtained through coercion. Your property is legally yours again. Hayes held out a deed. You can reclaim it whenever you wish. Grace took the document with trembling hands, staring at the familiar description of the land she and Henry had loved. I can go back, she whispered, more to herself than to Hayes. If that's what you want, he said carefully, his expression neutral despite the tension evident in his shoulders. Grace studied the deed, memories flooding back the day she and Henry had first seen the property, their plans for fields and orchards, the small house they had built with their own hands. Good memories, important ones. But as she looked up at Hayes, she realized those memories no longer defined her future. They were part of her past, a past she would always honor, but not one she needed to physically return to. "No," she said finally, setting the deed on his desk. "I don't want to go back." Hayes's eyes searched hers. "Are you certain? You don't have to decide immediately." "I am certain," Grace replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "That land was part of a dream Henry and I shared. Going back alone won't bring that dream back. It would just be empty." She moved around the desk until she stood before him. "These past months, I've found something I never expected, not just safety or sanctuary, but a new purpose, new feelings." The last word came out barely above a whisper. Hayes rose slowly, hope dawning in his eyes. "Grace, I'll always love Henry," she continued. "He'll always be part of me, but my heart didn't die with him. It's still beating, still capable of love." She took a deep breath. "Still falling in love despite my best efforts not to." Hayes reached for her hands, holding them gently in his own. "I promised myself I wouldn't rush you, that I would give you all the time you needed to heal." His voice roughened with emotion. "But every day, watching you rebuild your life with such courage, such grace, how could I not fall in love with you?" He brought one hand to her cheek, his touch reverent. "I love you, Grace Porter, and if you'll have me, I want to build a future with you right here on the Rocking J." Grace leaned into his touch, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." When Hayes kissed her, it felt like coming home, not to the home she had lost, but to one she had found when she least expected it. His arms around her were strong yet gentle, his lips tender but certain. They were married in the fall, with yellow leaves carpeting the ground and the first hint of winter in the air. The ceremony took place on the porch of the Rocking J, with Mrs. Thornton sniffling happily into her handkerchief and ranch hands standing awkwardly in their Sunday best. The Alliance families attended, including the Millers in their newly rebuilt home, all celebrating not just a union but the community they had forged together. Grace wore a simple ivory dress, her auburn hair adorned with wildflowers. Hayes couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked toward him, his expression one of wonder and profound gratitude. As they spoke their vows, Grace felt Henry's presence not as a ghost haunting her new happiness, but as a blessing upon it. She would always carry him in her heart, just as Hayes would always honor Olivia's memory. Their past loves had shaped them into the people who now stood before each other, ready to build a shared future. "I, Hayes Jackson, take you, Grace Porter, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Hayes spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the assembled guests. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." When Grace repeated the vows, she did so with absolute certainty. This wasn't a replacement for what she had lost, but something new and equally precious, a second chance at love and family that she would cherish with her whole heart. The following spring found Grace standing on that same porch, watching Hayes work with a young colt in the corral. Her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, evidence of the new life growing within her. The Rocking J was flourishing under their joint care, cattle fat on good grass, new outbuildings constructed, the main house brightened with fresh paint and curtains. Blackwater Mining Company had abandoned its operations in the valley entirely. Emmett Sinclair had fled the territory ahead of an indictment, his empire crumbling as investigations revealed the full extent of his criminal activities. The alliance of ranchers and farmers remained strong, helping each other through hard times and celebrating good ones. Hayes looked up from his work, catching sight of Grace watching him. His face broke into a smile that still made her heart skip, even after months of marriage. He secured the colt, then jogged to the porch, taking the steps two at a time. "How are my girls doing?" he asked, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "We're just fine," Grace assured him. "Though your daughter is restless today, she kicks like she's already practicing to ride." Hayes laughed, wrapping his arms around her. She'll be strong like her mother. Grace leaned into his embrace, savoring the solid warmth of him. I was thinking about the day we met, how everything can change in an instant. For the better sometimes, Hayes murmured against her hair. Yes, Grace agreed, turning in his arms to face him. That day, when I had nothing left, you said the ranch was mine until I was strong again. Hayes's expression softened with memory. I remember. I didn't understand then what you were really offering. Not just shelter, but a chance to rebuild more than walls and fences, a chance to rebuild my heart. She reached up to touch his face, tracing the familiar lines with tender fingers. I am strong again now, Hayes, because of you, because of us. We're strong together, he corrected gently. That's how it works. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Hayes and Grace stood together on the porch of their home, no longer his, no longer temporary for her, but theirs in every way that mattered. The rocking J stretched before them, a legacy to pass to their children and perhaps their children's children someday. From tragedy had come healing, from loss had come gain, from the ashes of one dream had risen another different but equally beautiful. Grace Porter Jackson had found her strength again, and with it, a love that would last a lifetime.